2-chip and 3-chip are just different terms for the same thing. All pre-1-chip consoles have blurry video output and are compatible with these mods regardless of board revision. I tend to just sidestep the debate by calling them non-1-chip, but for the sake of clarity and since it aligns with the SNES RGB 2-chip bypass name that Voltar uses for one of the mod components, I'm going to refer to these systems as 2-chip consoles through the remainder of this video. So I'm sorry if that's not the favored nomenclature for anyone watching. You know who you are.
I feel personally attacked. Greetings in the Tech Cave. Fenris here, and today I have in front of me a loose SHVC CPU 01 motherboard. So the story behind this is that this was originally a parts board. The CPU on it was just totally dead, so I used its PPU-1 and PPU-2 to fix other dead Super Famicoms. And this had sat in my parts bin for about a year or so, and then eventually I got my hands on an APU Rev motherboard that had a completely destroyed board because someone tried to remove the cartridge slot and thought it was going to be like this revision of the motherboard where it just pops off. So they put a screwdriver underneath and kept trying to dig it out, cutting a ton of traces. So rather than let that board go to waste, what I did is I took its APU chip and fixed a 1-chip that was dead, and I took the rest of its core hardware to restore this board. Now, fun thing, if you ever find an SHVC CPU 01 with a B-Rev CPU and a C-Rev PPU-2, that is not stock. That is most likely repaired within like the past 5-ish years. And the reason why I say that is because the latest chipsets that you'll find for this particular motherboard would be an A-Rev CPU and a B-Rev PPU-2, or other words, a 213 configuration, which is the most common. So, while it is great that I have a working system board, obviously this is not the system, it's just the board. It's the heart, but not the whole body. So what is one to do, right? Well, since I did the Ultimate Super Nintendo last time, what we're gonna do is build the Ultimate Super Famicom. Now, I have a ton of parts here, and I finally got the last component I needed to finally build this system. So let's not waste any more time, and let's build ourselves the Ultimate Super Famicom. So naturally, the first step of building our Ultimate Super Famicom is breaking the board down and getting it ready for a recap. So let's do it. Okay, now that we got the motherboard fully broken down, we can now start removing components. And I'm not going to bother explaining, you've seen me do this plenty of times, so let's just not waste any time and get to it. Alright, so I got the original cast removed as well as the regulator and the fuse. So all that's left to do at this point is to clean the affected areas and install some new ones. Okay, so I've already went ahead and installed the new capacitors as well as the new fuse. But you may notice though, we don't have the 100 microfarad capacitors installed. And the reason why is we're not going to be installing the 100 microfarad capacitors. Rather, we're going to be installing these. These are 220 microfarad tantalum capacitors. Now, the reason why we're using 220 microfarad capacitors is the way that these capacitors are stacked with each other means that we have 200 microfarads of capacitance per line. So rather than use 4 100 microfarad capacitors, we can just simplify it by just adding 2 220 microfarad capacitors. And in fact, Nintendo would later do that with a GPM board onwards anyways. Now, why exactly tantalum? It's mainly because I don't have any 220 microfarad capacitors in electrolytic form. Tantalums are fine to use just as long as the voltage is 4 volts or higher. So, without wasting any more time, let me show you how to get these installed. So our first order of business is determining where we're going to install our tantalums. So we're going to install them on C57 and C59. The reason why is because these two landings are the closest to the final multi-out circuit. Now, as far as positioning, so when it comes to surface mount electrolytic capacitors, the stripe side is always going to be your negative. For tantalums, however, the stripe side is positive. So you want to make sure that it's positioned somewhat like this. Now, as far as how we're going to install it, we're going to tin the positive poles and then slowly introduce the capacitor as we apply heat to the positive side, making sure not to damage the tantalum along the way. So, without further delay, let's get to it. Okay, we got the positive terminal soldered in, so now we just gotta do the negatives. Okay, so now that we got the tantalums installed, we can now move on to the next step, which is installing our big boy 1K capacitor on C67, and as well as C81 for our vertical bar fix, which is our 22 microfarad X5R cap. So let's get to it. Okay, so now that we got all the capacitors reinstalled, we can now move on to the next step. And you might be thinking, oh, this is the part where you're just going to install the 100 microfarad capacitors and call it good, right? Wrong. We are going to be doing a couple of that, but our next step is what I've really been waiting for. It's time to edge. Now what I have here is the real star of the show. This is the SNES Edge Enhancer. This is a mod for the SNES 3-chip systems that solve one of the major issues that plague Super Nintendo and Super Famicoms that were released prior to the 1-chip. Now, this was a collaborative effort between Voltar, Mike Chi of RetroTank, Steve Kulov of HD Retrovision, as well as the master of chip decapping himself, Furtek. Furtek decapped and provided clear die shots of the PPU-2 to the other three in order to better understand how the DAC was constructed. The end result is a robust mod that remedies the infamous SNES 3-chip blurring that plagues most SNES and SFC systems. Now, there have been attempts like this in the past with a mod called the SNES RGB filter, but the problem is those mods apply what is effectively just a sharpening filter over the image by overboosting the DAC. Now, if installed wrong, it can pull the DAC down and brick the PPU too. But even with it being installed correctly, the result of it is incredibly inconsistent between system revisions and the games being played. So it's high risk, low reward. Now, what makes the Edge Enhancer different is it's not applying a sharpening filter to the system. Rather, it is a video recovery appliance that intercepts the output of the PPU-2 and recovers the slow transition of colors. That is the root cause of the blur. Meaning, there is no risk of bricking the PPU-2, unless you bridge something you really shouldn't, and you get one chip quality throughout all systems and all games. So, with all that being said, this is going to be the main core of our ultimate Super Famicom. So, we're going to bring the board back in and install this sexy piece of kit. So the first order of business is disconnecting the PPU-2's outputs from the rest of the board, which can be done by removing Q3, Q5, and Q7 here. So let's fire up the hot air rework station and get these little suckers off. Okay, so now that we got the transistors off, we now need to install the interposer, which you need to make sure that you have the correct interposer for your system. Since I'm working with the SHVC CPU01, that means I need the SHVC CPU01 interposer. So we just need to make sure that this is lined up good and we can start soldering it in. So just to quickly show, the interposer should line up with these little solder pads right here by the transistors. And as you can see for our Ultimate Super Famicom, we were able to line it up just right. So as long as we have these 3 points lined up correctly, the rest should be just fine. So let's get this all soldered up and install the core. Okay, so I did have to go off camera a bit to touch up on the soldering, mainly because it was a little difficult seeing the small castellated edges, considering how far away the board is from me. Maybe I can look into investing in a proper microscope so that way I'm not struggling so much. But, you know, for the time being, I think we did a good job installing the interposer. And one other neat little feature about this board Voltar already went ahead and installed AC coupling capacitors along C91 to C94, which is excellent. We don't have to add 100 microfarad capacitors on those particular spots, but I will come back and add 100 microfarad capacitors on C90 and C95 just for the sake of completion. You don't need to do it, and it's not listed on the instructions to do it. It's just something that I want to do for the sake of it feeling, complete. But in any case, now that we got the interposer installed, we're going to come in with our core and solder that in. Okay, we have the core installed now, so this area is all good. So now we just need to turn our attention to this area right here, because before we install the next part of the edge enhancer, we need to remove some components. Okay, so according to Voltar's instructions, we need to remove a few components in order to disconnect both the RGB outputs to the multi-out as well as the RGB inputs to the video encoder. So the components we're removing are R19, R18, R14, R13, R9, R8, C8, C7, and C6. So let's fire up the hot air rework station and get these off. Now, you could try to get these with a soldering iron, but due to how close proximity all these components are, it's better to use a hot air rework station and some fine tweezers. So let's get to it. Okay, so back over to our little edge enhancer here. We're going to be putting 3 wires down on the R, G, and B mixer side. That way we can feed the RGB lines from the edge enhancer back onto the board. And we're going to be soldering them up to the rightmost pads of C8, C7, and C6. So let me just get a 3-conductor ribbon prepped and we can solder that on. Okay, so we got our conductors installed onto the edge enhancer board. So we can now move over to where we pulled all those components and solder in R, G, and B respectively. So let's get to it. All right, we got the RGB mixer signals wired back into our Super Famicom main board. So all that's left to do for the edge enhancer install is to come up here and install the multi-out QSB. Alright, so before finalizing the install for the edge enhancer, we're going to install the two 100 microfarad capacitors on C90 and C95 here. That way we can clean up the board and then install the ribbon. So let's get to it. Okay, so we have all the bottom hardware installed, and I even went ahead and installed the 78SO5 back on the board. So all we need to do now is clean the board and install the flat flex cable. Now, just as a quick reminder, you don't need to install these two 100 microfarad capacitors if all you want to do is install the edge enhancer. The only reason why I personally do it is to make sure that a C90 to C95 has an AC coupling capacitor attached to them. C91 to C94 has some attached to it due to the interposer for the edge enhancer. So I just wanted to add these two for the sake of completion, but it is not integral for the edge enhancer install. I just want to make that very clear so nobody mistakes this as part of that install. This is just a me thing. So with that out of the way, let's clean this board and install the flat flex cable. Okay, so with the board all cleaned up, we can now install our flat flex cable. So when it comes to installing the flat flex cable, we need to make sure that the blue tab is facing out. So we're going to disengage the clips here and just carefully work in our blue cable. Make sure it's all the way in there. Lock it in. Then we're going to come down to the interposer board, straighten it out, and I see we are going to need to do a couple folds. So let's bend it back like right there should be fine. Just lightly press. Don't like do a lot of force because you don't want to damage the flat flex cable. Disengage this clip here. Then we're just going to come in. Oh, I didn't disengage it far enough. So there we go. I'm just going to come in and install the cable like so. And there we go. We now have the edge enhancer installed into our board completely. So with that, the hardware is basically done at this point. All we need to do now is take care of the sound module, which you've already seen me do plenty of times, so I'm not going to bother boring you with that, and reassemble our system. So let's get to it. Okay, so I've gone ahead and recapped the sound module as well as performed the necessary stereo fix, which if you want more details about this as well as opening up the sound module to get access to the board, I would recommend checking out my Super Famicom restoration video. I cover this process in greater detail there. But in any case, with the sound module now complete, we basically have all the hardware done. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in the main board, plug this in, and we're going to give this a quick test before we button everything up. So let's get to it. Okay, so I have everything kind of hooked up here. I have the sound module plugged in, the heatsink for the 78SO5, the cartridge slot, the power switch, and the controller board. So we're just going to test this hardware before we button everything up. So what we're going to do is we're going to plug in our burn-in test cart, plug in power, and this time I'm going to work my way backwards. So I'm going to start with composite, then S-video, then RGB SCART, just to make sure that everything is working. So let's test composite. We got composite video. I'm gonna plug in S-video. We got S-video, so the mix circuit works. And finally, RGB SCART. Ooh. Was it my cable? Nope, there we go. Not sure what that was all about, but looks like we got RGB SCART. Hit burn-in. Alright. Looks like we're passing so far. And it passes. Not sure what that blue and green screen was about. Probably the cable wasn't seated all the way. But let's see if we run through the tests. Alright, pass all the tests. So it looks like our Super Famicom motherboard is good to go. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna put all the shielding back on, and then we're going to put it into our brand new shell. But actually, before we do that, we need to take care of this controller port, because much like with the Ultimate Super Nintendo, we need to give this an RGB LED to make it the Ultimate Super Famicom. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and once I take care of that, we're going to put the shielding back on the sound module and get this thing buttoned up. So prepping the controller board is basically the same as it is with the Super Nintendo, but it's just in a smaller profile. If you want to see how exactly I went about doing that, you can check out the Ultimate Super Nintendo video. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to desolder all of these controller contacts, as well as the LED and resistor. That way this board is free from the front piece. And we're going to replace the LED and resistor with an RGB LED and a 100 ohm resistor. So without further delay, let's get to it. Okay, so now that we got the controller port as well as the sound module all ready to go, we can now move on to the final step, and that is reassembling our system. Okay, so before we move on to final reassembly, we need to make a couple of key notes here. So first off, we need to make sure that we do not install the top and bottom shielding. It was brought to my attention by Voltar that the top and bottom shielding actually introduce noise to the system. Meaning, if we were to install these, it's going to basically render the mod moot. I mean, sure, the edges will be sharper, but there's now noise in the picture because this shielding is installed. So it's better to just toss these aside and forget all about it. The other thing to note, when installing the SHVC CPU 01 into the RGR shell, you need to snip a couple of plastic tabs in order to make sure that the board can sit flush. You need to snip this little plastic tab right here, or plastic peg, and I think this one right here. Let me take a closer look. Yeah. So there are two plastic pegs here that need to be snipped off, so that way the SHVC CPU 01 can sit down properly. So with those notes out of the way, let's move on to final reassembly. Okay, now we can move on to final testing. So we have the Ultimate Super Famicom all plugged up. I have the RT5X set to composite, and we're gonna start by making sure the hardware still works. So got in our burn-in test cart, and it looks like it's still working, and our RGB mixing circuit is also working because we got color on composite. So let's scroll down to the burn-in test just to make sure everything is good. So passing, 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 pass. Okay, passes the burn-in test. Now let's make sure all of our video formats work. So let's start with S-Video. Switch over to S-Video. S-Video still works. And of course, the real star of the show, RGB. RGB still works. So let's just pull this out. Now, I'm not going to show any comparisons right this second between stock and modded, but stay tuned towards the end of the video. I do have some footage recorded of a stock system as well as this system running in action. So in the meantime, let's just make sure that the system does work. So first order of business, Super Mario Kart for testing mode 7. Okay, looks like mode 7 is working. So next we're gonna pop in some Donkey Kong Country just to make sure the CIC still works. Looking good so far. And we are able to get into the game, so that is working. Next, we're going to test expansion pin games with Star Fox 2 here. And that's looking to be working. Looks good to me. And last, but certainly not least, we got to test with some Kamen Rider. So, just gonna pop that out, plug it in, and fire it up. And it looks like it's booting Kamen Rider. Alright. So with that, the Ultimate Super Famicom is fully working. Now, again, I'd like to thank Voltar as well as Mike, Stikulov, and Furtek for making this mod a reality. Like, you don't see it just yet, but there is a stark difference between a stock system and this beautiful Edge Enhancer modded Ultimate Super Famicom. So it's been a long time coming, but I am so glad we have finally reached that point in time where even the 3-chip systems can be just as good as a 1-chip. With that being said, guys, thank you all so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, until the blue moon rises, I'll see you next time.